The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host who loves these books and is getting to the part of this book that is really, really fun to read and also really annoying to stop reading every week. And I am joined by Greg, who I feel like has to be feeling that frustration only extra because he doesn't know what is coming next. Greg, the past couple of weeks, we've started with kind of a pace check on this book. I feel like I know the answer. We're going fast-paced in this. How did it land for you? It feels like this is kind of your first experience of what the ending of this book looks like. How did you like these two chapters?
I liked them a lot. Hi, everybody. We, of course, are talking about Chapter 54, Into the Palace, and Chapter 5, Into the Deep of the Shadow Rising. I always like to remind people as if they stumbled into this episode somehow. I'm not sure. But I guess sometimes like my app skips episodes, so it could be helpful in some cases. I would say that this is the plot group I'm least interested in. So while I enjoyed that this came to a climax for them, I'm still feeling like, but I really would rather be with Perrin or Rand than with the women in Tanchico. And so
Sexist.
Well, A, yes. And B, like, it still was enjoyable. I think part of my enjoyment, and I'm going to state this slightly vaguely, is just that largely speaking, there were no surprises here. I feel like last week we heard them form a plan. This week they did the plan. And there were some moments that we will talk about because that's what we have to do. And certainly things that I wouldn't say I expected. But largely speaking, the plan went off mostly without a hitch or with some hitches they could easily overcome. So I think that was surprising to me. That I was surprised I wasn't surprised more within these chapters.
No, and I think that makes sense. There's also a part of me that wonders, we've talked a couple of times about this was the plot that we think got the most kind of left on the cutting room floor. I wonder if that lack of setup is what's going on here, right? Is that these chapters really could have landed if the character moments had felt like they had been built to in a more effective way, or if kind of the trepidations that some of the characters are facing had been developed earlier on. I think that's where I'm kind of at. This is satisfying. It works, but it's also kind of the least interesting of the three plots in this book, in part just because it's the shortest one. Any last thoughts here before we dive into the very long summary of the first of these chapters, which will be followed by a very quick summary of the second?
Can I just finish the book? Please, Tylor, come on. Let me finish the book. Let me finish it. No. Let's start with Chapter 54, Into the Palace.
Just to be clear, Greg cannot finish the book. The rest of you do whatever the hell you want. You can come back and listen to these episodes next week. That'll be great. In Chapter 54, Into the Palace, the girls are bounced on the uneven roads while they are riding in a carriage, and Elayne initially tries to use her knowledge from riding on ships to cross her arms and not hold on to anything, which works pretty well for the swaying of a ship, but it turns out does not work very well when occasionally you crash into a pothole, and everyone is especially kind of grumpy about this. As they are making their way through the area, it's worth noting that they are wearing kind of beat up garb that makes them look like the average refugee, and they are trying to avoid notice as much as possible. We learn that Bail Domon is the one who is kind of driving the cart, and they are making their way into the Panarch's palace. They do pass several layers of guards for some of the White Cloaks, who Domon has to discuss things with for quite some time, and then some guards of the Panarch who seem to be much more familiar with him and seem to accept a number of kind of excuses or explanations that he gives for why he would be there. Most notably, that he is giving away the ice peppers, which we learned earlier the Panarch especially likes. The girls notice first Jaikim Carradine, and they note that he looks especially worried. Then they hear a cry that the Panarch is dead, and the crowd looks like it is ready to explode. Once they are inside, they see one of the Black Aja, Marilyn Gemalfin, who is not paying any attention, or else she would notice the fact that they have the ability to channel. Once they get a little bit further away, Elayne is outraged at the quantity of the food in the larders while people are starving outside, and Nynaeve chides her for being loud, but she seems kind of justifiably outraged. At this point, they change into clothing that looks like the servants, and Elayne finds this clothing to be indecent. Apparently, the Shan-Chan have very different ideas about what we're supposed to wear. And at this point, they overhear a number of the cooks upset that one of the Black Aja has a number of demands, and Elayne, because she's not holding anything, is kind of yelled at and told to take some food to someone, and she curtsies, which causes the person to say she's being mocked, which very much confuses Elayne because she gave the exact same curtsy that everyone gives to her. At this point, they reach some stairs and they decide to split up, with Elayne and Elayne going towards Amathera and Nynaeve going elsewhere. At this point, the riot can be heard outside, and we hear that the guards have been drawn away. Nynaeve argues against Elayne going with either of them and kind of is defensive about both directions, but eventually she allows it to happen, and even though she clearly doesn't trust Elayne, she trusts Elayne. Once they get to Amathera's door, there are no guards there, but Elayne detects channeling on the other side of the door. Elayne says they should leave, but instead Elayne tells her to throw open the door, and then Elayne immediately starts to channel, which she is able to cut off the woman of the Black Aja and free Amathera. When she's questioned about why she did so, because they're not supposed to channel, she says that her channeling would be mistaken for the channeling of the Black Aja in the room. They ask Amathera whether there are other Black Aja nearby, and she says no. And she says the Black Aja forced her to make bad decisions from the throne, but Tamail, the one who they just cut off, was the worst. She tortured her both in dreams and out. At this point, Elayne is surprised by her own strength and the power and is able to lift Tamail with bonds of air, and Elayne wishes that they could bring her to justice, but knows that won't be possible. Amathera insists that her soldiers will succeed if she's able to rouse them, but Elayne convinces her, at least for the moment, to leave quietly. At this point, we switch into Nynaeve's POV. Nynaeve enters the exhibition hall, and she sees what is either a brontosaurus or a giraffe skeleton. She approaches the collar, feeling the sadness in it, and she also gets angry that the Black Aja want to control someone from her village, and she gets so angry that she is able to channel. At this point, she sees a servant, and after a moment, she recognizes her face, and she strikes out with the power at the woman, and the woman is suddenly Moghedien. Her flow, trying to push the woman over, is cut, and compulsion is used on her, and very briefly she feels the desire to please this woman until she cuts the weave herself, copying what Moghedien did. At this point, Nynaeve tries to block Moghedien, while at the same time trying to fend off attempts from Moghedien to block her. Nynaeve realizes that she is afraid of how close she is to losing, and she starts to consider whether she should put her all into attack or defense, but she knows that she is only staying by because they are dividing their attentions. At this point, Moghedien, of course, monologues about how her plans have been ruined, and then she threatens to turn Nynaeve into a stool for mounting horses. At this point, she comments on the sad bracelets, saying that they are indestructible, and eventually allow the man to exert control just as much as the woman does, and since the man will go mad, that inevitably means that there will be significant problems for whatever woman wants to control the person. She says if you can trust someone else, you can split the control with another person, but there are other downsides to this. At this point, Nynaeve realizes that Moghedien is at her limit just as much as Nynaeve is, and she keeps talking, but only to distract Nynaeve. And Nynaeve realizes that she needs a way to distract Moghedien, so she feints fatigue and then throws the collar at Moghedien, which is just enough to let her shield work. She then holds her in the air with flows of air, and at this point, Moghedien tries to bargain for her release, but Nynaeve weaves a gag of air and threatens her to also be a mounting block, although she thinks to herself that she isn't that cruel. She just wants Moghedien to think she is. Nynaeve then puts the bracelets in her bag along with the seal, which is protected by a weave of illusion, and then she realizes that it won't be possible for her to take Moghedien, and she tries to leave. But at this point, one of the Black Aja, I believe it's Jane Kide, who has the rod that shoots balefire, arrives, and she starts shooting the balefire rod. Nynaeve dodges a couple of blasts, and then there is an enormous silence as one of the blasts seems to tear the palace apart, and Nynaeve both wonders how Moghedien vanished in the chaos, and also wonder whether or not the Black Aja survived the balefire and is glad that Nynaeve herself did. Action-packed chapters often mean lots of summary and a little bit less conversation. We didn't talk about this beforehand. My first question to you is one that normally happens off air. Do you feel like this is a long episode? I don't know if I have a lot to say or a little to say about this chapter.
Gosh, I'm not sure, which I'll say for the second time now that I unmuted myself. Sorry, my dog had a barking spell. So this can stay in from the edit, Tyler. Tyler, did you know I stood up and walked away? Did you see?
I did, yes.
Oh, okay. I thought because I came back, you were so deep in your notes. I'm like, I'm not sure he even knew I walked away. But
I was surprised when I looked up and you were back.
Some rude people decided to park in the very public parking in front of my house, and my dog freaked out
How dare they?
about it. So I know. Yeah, I mean, I think I was just surprised listening to you that it went on so much, because in my memory, it's like, yeah, like kind of like I said, not a lot surprising happened. They just kind of did all the pieces of the plot, and there are a lot of things there that we will pick apart, but I think, again, kind of on the theme of nothing was that surprising. It just means that we maybe didn't get the kind of character moment developments that we often get in those. It's not zero, but there's less of that and more. Let's just make sure that we have a kind of, it's the Marvel movie thing. It's like everybody's gonna punch each other in the last act, and then somebody wins and somebody loses. And I think this was just to make sure that, well, I guess, at least as far as we've read, that the girls seem like they're going to win in this plot line.
So I think the one thing that's really interesting about this is that each of the characters does have kind of, I think, a really important character moment in this chapter. And for both of them, it is a recognition of how much they've grown and developed in the power, right? Elayne kind of surprises herself with how much she is able to kind of reason through when she can and can't channel, and she overcomes one of the Black Aja. And Nynaeve, of course, shocks herself when she is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than one of the Forsaken. And so I think what's really interesting to me is these feel like they could be really big defining moments, but one, Robert Jordan's narration doesn't really focus on that kind of crisis of confidence. It's just like afterwards, they're like, wow, I can't believe I did that. And second, I think there's something a little bit odd about two characters who this entire book have been insisting they don't need any help, having their big final moment be, hey, guess what? I can do it on my own.
Yes. And to that, I would only add Elaine's early moments that I don't know if I would, your narrative was about how far they've grown, and we haven't seen her like grow into this, but so much of that opening section is her just demonstrating she's a good ruler, right? And so it felt to me like Robert Jordan is putting the seeds down now that when we get to the end of book 14 and we have presumably Elayne on the throne, we will feel at peace that there is a good benevolent ruler who thinks of the people who are starving and not just the royal larder, as the case may be. So I don't think we've ever seen Elayne need to grow into that. Like, I think this is just an innate characteristic, but it does stand as a part of her maturity across the chapter.
Yeah, I think one thing we've talked about before is contrasting characters against themselves, right? You've talked about before, one of the most effective ways to develop a character is show them doing the same thing a second time. I think what's really interesting here is we're learning a lot about Elayne, not by comparing her to herself, but by comparing her to Amathera, right? And so there's this interesting question at the end of the chapter. We're probably left wondering how much of it was Amathera versus how much of it was the Black Aja. But I think to some degree, what we're seeing here is a really effective work of Robert Jordan saying, we haven't spent enough time with these characters, so let me give at least kind of like one glimpse of what is to come for them, hopefully. I also just want to count, if we are now adding up all of the people who could potentially be the ruler of some country, let's add Amathera as another character in our list down that line. Boy, do we have a lot of potential rulers for the next generation. My only other note in the early part of this chapter is I just want to highlight Jaikim Carradine doesn't really play much of a role at all in this kind of like epic conclusion of this plot, but we should kind of put a pin on the fact that he is still around because he was afraid he would be murdered in the first chapter of this book. And they note that he is looking very worried, which makes sense because one of his relatives is being killed every month. I just wanted to note that that character still exists. Was there anything else other than the kind of Elayne and the Larders moment early in the chapter that stood out to you?
Just that I did enjoy the comedy of Elayne being like, I will act as kind as I can and curtsy, and that is read as like a sarcastic slam. And I liked the comedy of like they leave the kitchen and they still hear the chef just like sputtering.
Yeah.
That is often how I engage with annoying people. I just sit and sputter for a while after they leave. So maybe that's me in my office hours. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that any students who happen to find my podcast.
It definitely is that all the time, every office hours. Having had office hours, that is how it works. Yeah, I did like that moment. Just the idea that Elayne has no idea that the way you treat a princess is not the way that you treat any other person in authority is a very funny joke to me. Then the interesting next moment to me is Nynaeve arguing almost simultaneously that Elayne should not be trusted with Elayne and also that she must go with Elayne because Nynaeve can handle things herself. I think that that moment works the best for me because it is presented from Elaine's POV, and that's the first time we've had that in a while. I think we've seen that from Nynaeve's perspective a few times, but from the outside, it looks very different without without Nynaeve explaining to us in her head why she is saying and thinking the things she is. What did you think about that moment? It felt like she dances back and forth repeatedly, and that's very telling for that character who's usually extremely decisive.
I did block that, and I also thought it worked on a metatextual level of just the fact that that's how I'm feeling, right?
Yeah.
Like Nynaeve is me, where it's like it just felt all too easy that this Sean Chan would join up, especially because the Sean Chan have been like a monolithic evil force.
Yeah.
And now it's like, oh, but we met one and this one's cool. And then I keep going like, but is she? And so I liked that Nynaeve was essentially doing the same thing. Like, I have no choice but to trust you alone with Elayne, but also I don't want to trust you alone with Elayne because you're Sean Chan.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the right read. It's really challenging in a story like this. This is actually something that's related to another kind of media problem. Is I've seen a lot of stories that are like one of the problems with only having, say, a small number of women in films is that anytime that one woman does something, it feels like it is representative of all women. And the only way to solve that problem is by having 10 women in your film so they can have 10 different roles, and then you can show that they're actually kind of diverse, right? That is the problem I'm having with the Sean Chan right now, right? We have encountered a grand total of 2 individuals of the Sean Chan who have really had any kind of meaningful interaction with our characters, and one of them was a slaver, and the other one is Elayne. And that makes it really hard to like Elayne, right? And I think that that's the dilemma both we as the readers and Nynaeve are dealing with right now is how do you square a character you really like with a society that is horrific?
If only there was some kind of, divide in America that required us to do that similar thinking. Yeah, of course, right? Like,
Yeah.
I do think, this is not grappling with the kind of more complicated modern history we have thinking about the Civil War, but it's not dissimilar, where it's like, we paint with a broad brush and say that anybody who existed in the slaveholding South must have been evil. No, they weren't.
Right.
There were good people down there, and some of those good people chose not to hold slaves, and some of those good people did because that was, the society and culture they're in.
Yep.
So you need to kind of treat it all with gradations and differences. But you're right that we just because we're only being given the two poles of that gradation, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't really know. It feels false, and again, I just return to I think it's great that Nynaeve is voicing that so that we feel okay feeling that.
Yeah.
But given the sum total of Egionen's action in this chapter, I wasn't feeling like she's a mole or a plant or somebody I have to watch out for. It feels like she's a member of the team, as
Yeah.
is anybody else.
I think this feels like the put up or shut up moment for Egyonin, and she did not let them down. And so I don't know whether that's enough to fully gain my trust, but it's certainly enough for me to say, like, from now on, if she wanted to get them, she had the chance, right? That's always the game you play with someone who's, going to pull the double cross is why didn't they at that previous point? This is our very first really good moment. Egyonin could have screwed them over at many points in this plan and chose not to. I don't really have a ton to say here about Elayne and Amathera and Tamael, partially because this is an action scene and partially because I think we have more to say about those characters in the next chapter, at least a couple of them, and I think it makes sense to wait to do it there. Did you have any thoughts on this kind of first of two action sequences before we move on to the Nynaeve POV?
Only, if it started in the larder, then it continues here where Elayne is demonstrating she's thinking strategically and at a higher level than Amathera. That's just like,
Yeah.
call my guards, let's end this. And it feels like we should note the contrast of those two characters, but we can get into that more next chapter.
Excellent. So in Nynaeve's POV, then, I just need to point out it's always fun trying to figure out what kind of animal is depicted in a skeleton in a book like this, because you just need to know who has its skull 20 feet in the air. The other kind of quick note that I had here is I really like one thing in this chapter, which is that we see a lot of types of magic or channeling that haven't been encountered by Nynaeve before. And I find it really fun when authors find ways of describing things that later on will become really systematized and we know there's like a magic system for them, but they're being described in kind of the fantastical, I don't know what's happening way, right? Nynaeve seeing through Mogedien's illusion, or later on in the chapter, realizing she has to reach through a statue to get to the Dark One's seal. Those felt like really cool moments because it didn't feel like the description of a channeler talking about channeling. It felt like the description of a layman talking about magic. And that's just a little more fun for me sometimes.
I like that point, and I think I was noting how many times they describe parts of the channeling as pulling air, pulling fire, pulling water, or
Yeah.
those. And so I would say that is one step back on this scale you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like we've never had a let's sit down and talk about how this all works. But now we are seeing kind of step two where it's just like, oh, that's the one you call upon for this type of task and so on.
Well, and I really like that the description of the magic depends on the character's level of knowledge, right? Because in this chapter, things Nynaeve isn't familiar with are described vaguely, and things that Nynaeve has done before are described in terms of air and water and fire and spirit. And then there's also, we've had Nynaeve in previous chapters, and she was not describing things in terms of different elements and flows. She was doing things by instinct. And so I think that's Robert Jordan kind of showing us that even though we didn't see any training in the White Tower, Nynaeve is just thinking about channeling fundamentally differently now than she was the last time we really saw her doing much of that, probably way back in like the second book, because I think Egwene got most of the POVs in the third book when those three characters were together.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's a good measure that he takes the narration seriously, right?
Yeah.
Not that we needed him to prove it, but it's very easy when you do first person narrators to even slip out of the perspective. And we've actually called him out on that a couple times when suddenly a wind is being described through a mountain that nobody can actually see or what have you. But like we know sorry. I didn't mean to invoke the opening in some
Yeah,
derogatory way.
I was going to say the
It's
wind
good.
is the one time that he's allowed to do that. Please don't hurt me like that.
But there were other examples or when the
Yeah,
perspective
no,
kind of
totally.
zoomed in a way you couldn't. Um, so I do think it's nice not just that he sticks to the bit, but also that he does this. So I just recently saw a movie. I totally am blanking on the name, but it was like this great premise, which is what if we show the like slasher attacks a
Oh,
cabin
yeah.
movie, but the camera never leaves the slasher. So like instead of seeing the drama in the cabin as they're worried about survival, you just follow the killer into the woods and back out of the woods and so on. Um, and it was so clever to do that. I'm like, yeah, I've never seen
Yeah.
that. Like, let's do that. And then like 30 minutes in, it was like, yeah, but the writing's not quite easy to do like this. So we got to
Yeah.
cheat it here, we got to cheat it there. And so to see somebody in this case sticking to their rules and then beyond that actually helping the perspective evolve as the character learns. That's like the second tier
Totally.
of really good first person narration. So I think Robert Jordan's definitely using it to good effect and using it accurately.
Speaking of using it to good effect, I think Robert Jordan actually gets away with a moment where he kind of leaves the first person perspective behind in this chapter. We get this description of the battle between Nynaeve and Moghedien, kind of one of them trying to block the other, and then the other one kind of simultaneously trying to block back, and it's kind of like an offense-defense thing. And there's a moment where Robert Jordan stops describing from Nynaeve's perspective and starts describing what a man who couldn't channel would see if he walked in the room. And
if
that's
somebody walked in, yeah.
and it's a really fun moment because it's like you would just see two women standing there sweating and grunting, which is hilarious to me. But it required stepping out of the first person POV, and I don't care in this instance. It felt like a really fun action sequence that would be the most boring on-screen action sequence, and I'm kind of here for it.
I feel like they'll have to cheat it when Amazon gets there. They'll want to do something else.
I think
We'll
Robert
see.
Jordan gave them the excuse, right? He's like, look, if you put in the 30-second Mogedy and Nynaeve nothing fight immediately afterwards, everything explodes, just like you want, TV executives.
Well, and I guess I'll just go in. I would say you often ask me like what was most intriguing or what's your big question about this chapter or something like that. And I would have gone with I'm really interested in whether Nynaeve actually beat this Forsaken. And I know you just started the fight, and I'm sure we want to track some of how Moghedien starts talking about like the real world, and you're like, Nynaeve, just pay attention. Just let me
Yeah.
hear what she's saying. Because there's another limit to the first person narrator. It's like, no, let's listen to that. But I would say the kind of whole conflict there, I'm not sure. Like Nynaeve clearly thinks she was strong enough to beat her, but doesn't believe that she should have been, which
Yeah.
makes me as the reader say, is there something going on there? Because Moghedien is able to eventually just kind of run off. It feels a little bit like maybe she was playing possum. But
Yeah.
to me, that's the big question, kind of leaving this plot after next chapter is did Nynaeve really get so powerful that she can go toe to toe, or is it there's some kind of trap being set there?
Boy, can I not answer that question in any meaningful way. I kept running through my like, okay, this is a good answer. No, I think that's next book. This is a good no, that's not been done yet. I got nothing for you. I thought that the thing that worked the best for me is exactly what you were describing in the lead into that is not quite knowing how much of what Moghedien is telling Nynaeve is true versus how much of it is meant to throw her off her guard made it a really fun kind of read the monologue and figure out what of it do we believe and is there anything we're not entirely kind of buying. And I thought that there was two really interesting moments in that. One is Moghedien assuming that Nynaeve is evil is a very interesting thing because it at least proves to Nynaeve that she is not omnipotent. She doesn't know everything about her. And then two, I really like the moment where it's very clear that Moghedien she just assumes that Nynaeve will either try to destroy it, get rid of it, or use it against Rand. There is no other option in her mind. And I'm kind of curious whether that is telling us something about Moghedien or telling us just how important Rand is, because it could be unnecessary, focus on her own idea, egotism, or it could be that Rand really matters that much that he's the only piece we should be paying attention to.
And I would say I lean towards that Moghedien knows Rand is the only important piece.
Yeah.
And so the last answer with the slight twist on it that to me, her references make it once more clear. It's another reminder that everything that's happening has happened before and will happen again, perhaps. So it feels to me that she's working off of precedent. So she doesn't necessarily know Nynaeve, but there's been, I'm sure, a figure who's done this in the Nynaeve role before, right? And if it's iterations of the same universe, strands of a multiverse, because the multiverse kind of comes up again. There's a hint at worlds beyond our world, maybe other planets. Like we got crazy things here. And so it to me feels like she's using her previous experiences to inform the current encounter. Whether she's doing so accurately or is not anticipating a swerve in the pattern, I think is left up to debate.
And I cannot have
You
that
can't say
debate.
anything.
This is why this podcast is a little bit frustrating from my perspective. To some degree, the end of this chapter is just like balefire, 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 run, run, run. Did you have any kind of thoughts on the action part of this sequence? Because I found the first half to actually be more engaging, even though nothing blows up, but maybe that's just me.
I feel like this book has talked about balefire a lot. So it feels like the Valyrian steel in Game of Thrones, where they reference, oh, this one, isn't it Valyrian? I have that right.
Yep.
Right. This weapon happens to be made of that. This weapon, and then you find out late in, I think, the 5th book that like, oh, this is the one way to kill the walkers. So now we have to track down all those swords and weapons and use that metal. And so it feels to me like balefire has some larger function to play. The fact that nobody seems able to control it immediately makes me think that somebody will eventually be able to control it, and that will be a major part of the plot. But
also,
you can't say anything.
I was just going to say, also note that Moghedien is terrified of it, right? Like she seems more afraid of that than she is of being blocked by Nynaeve, right? And that should tell you everything you need to know about how dangerous balefire is.
But yeah, other than like thinking that it has some larger role to play, it does feel like Deus ex machina. Let's just wipe everything out and start, get everybody out of this scene, largely surviving.
Let's get out of this scene and into the deep. Chapter 55. Nynaeve flees. She is losing her hold on Saidar because she is now panicking rather than being angry. She does see Liandrin and is glad that she is no longer able to channel because there is no glow around her. And then she reaches the others, and we learn that Amathera did once try to escape and rouse her guards, but Elayne did something to her, and now she seems perfectly well behaved. Elayne noticed the channeling because there was an enormous amount of it and asked about Nynaeve and how things went with her. Nynaeve immediately thanks Egianin for immediately going to try to help because Elayne says that she did until Elayne stopped her. And then Nynaeve apologizes for endangering the mission, saying that she got so concerned about whether or not she could bring Moghedien to justice that she lost her focus on everything else. And as a result, she was not really able to, do everything they could and even risk losing the sad bracelets as we've come to know them. Elayne is mostly shocked rather than disappointed to learn that Nynaeve was able to take on one of the Forsaken, and suddenly a bleeding Julin bursts through a doorway and says there is a way out, and as they walk out, they see hundreds of Domon's men who are battling and holding the mob at bay. They quickly get out of the building, and Tom offers his service to Amathera, who says she is just a refugee and refers to herself as Thera. Soon, they make their way into Rendra's kitchen, and when they arrive there, Thera says that she is just a refugee looking for work, and Rendra agrees to let her work in the kitchen, and she is sent away. We learn that Elayne actually used some of her political acumen to convince Amathera that she could be deposed by the mob just as easily as supported by them, and so as a result, Elayne basically says that she needs to learn what it means to be a commoner, and so she is forcing Amathera to spend a few days working in the kitchen before eventually it seems the plan is to have her clear the White Cloaks and the Black Aja out of the Panarch's palace and eliminate the threats in the area. Tom says that he thinks Elayne will be a fine queen, and she seems quite pleased about this. At this point, Bail Domon says he has owned the seal of the Dark One's prison before, but Nynaeve doubts it, even though we know it is true. And Nynaeve insists that the seal can be sent to the White Tower, but she says that the bracelets and collar cannot be. She clearly does not trust the White Tower with that much power. They try to destroy the bracelets using fire, but it doesn't seem to warm even a little bit, even though Elayne says she has put enough heat into it to cause stone to melt into lava. And then Bail Domon is tasked with dropping the bracelets and collar into the deepest part of the ocean. Although it is worth noting, the place that he says the deepest part of the ocean is exactly where we know the Seanchan are from chapter 1 of this book. They then say they will go downstairs and see how Thera is doing and head for the White Tower soon. I did give one piece of information that isn't quite in the chapter, but we theoretically know in that summary. Other than that, what did you take out of Into the Deep?
Let's just wrap things up, right? I mean, we've talked before about the HBO show where the 9th episode is really exciting, and then the 10th episode is just like whatever you have to tie up. And this felt like, let's just tie up this plot. Not in your summary, but stood out to me is Nynaeve was kind of her final thought is like, and I'll get back to land because that's what matters in this world. Which made me think she's not getting back to land for a while, but is a sweet kind of character beat to close on. But you know, I think you had mentioned previously that one of your readings you really were debating whether Tom was Elayne's father, and I saw that relationship in this chapter, like how you would easily debate like, yeah, but you know, I think even if there's no biological connection there, as somebody who grew up without a father, it only makes sense that she kind of is unused to that kind of male attention, that kind of you know, the kind we all us sons often want, like to be told they're proud of us and so on. So I felt like that was very sweet and telling. And yet, you know, I think everything in the first part of the chapter just proves again that Elayne is a really good person and is ready to be a good leader, which is exciting to see.
Yeah, I think if the last chapter was very much about let's get the plot done and not have as much character in it, this feels like the chapter that is kind of designed to let us see the little bits of character growth, right? Even to the point that Elaine's interaction with Amathera is told in flashback in this chapter rather than directly in the previous one. I think that kind of lends the idea that we're supposed to see the character growth here in a way that maybe we couldn't when all of the balefire was flying around in the last chapter. I guess that is why I do get just a little bit frustrated that one of the last moments of the chapter is Nynaeve failing the Bechdel test, right? Like we finally had a chapter where the girls accomplished all of the things on their own with minimal assistance from the dudes, and yet they end the book being like, well, I guess if Elayne can fall in love with an insane person, I can be with Lan. And that's a weird note to end this very kind of feminist forward plot on.
Yeah, and noted, but it also is just sweet.
It works.
As the guy who usually misses the romance, like I was glad to see it and glad to know that, you know, I think Lan has taken a back seat in this particular book. So good to know somebody still cares about him.
That is absolutely valid. The first moment that really stood out to me in this chapter, kind of chronologically, is Nynaeve's apology. A, because Nynaeve doesn't apologize a lot, and B, I was honestly not entirely convinced that Nynaeve's apology was necessary. I kind of thought in the previous chapter she handled things pretty appropriately. She maybe delayed for a few seconds to figure things out, but I didn't think a big I endangered the mission because I became obsessed with Mogadien instead of what we came for was really in order from her, which is odd for me because normally my complaint is Nynaeve needs to apologize far more. So what did you take of that kind of moment in the scene? Was it, I assume Robert Jordan was kind of trying to show us Nynaeve growing up, but I almost felt like it was apologizing for nothing.
Which isn't failing the Bechdel test literally, but seems like failing modern feminism, right? With the stop apologizing so much. You don't know as many apologies as society seems to think you do. Yeah, I don't think anything in the previous chapter had made me feel like Nynaeve made a mistake or owed a debt to this group. I think, you know, it felt very video gamey. When there's a giant boss, you go fight the giant boss and clear that out. And even if the great treasure is in that room or the princess is right there near Bowser, you got to kill Bowser first. So
Yeah.
it felt to me like I don't think she put the mission at risk in order to do what she did.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's a really funny moment in there that I'm not entirely sure if it's meant to be funny or not, where Elayne kind of basically accepts Nynaeve's apology with what could very easily be read as like a shrug and a okay, sure, whatever you say. Um, Other than that, I'll be honest, I do not have many notes on this chapter, right? Elayne and Amathera is an interesting moment, right? Teach the person who doesn't have any connection with her kingdom that she needs to know what the normal people are like. But I don't really have a ton to say about that. Elayne seems like she handled that situation well.
Yeah, it's on the page. So I think appreciating that it's so obvious a lesson, but not dismissing it as not important just because
Yeah.
it may be kind of obvious. Um, I will then say I then when they I don't have a lot to say about trying to destroy the Care Angry Al and then failing because we're just told this is something that power doesn't work on.
Yep.
So dropping it in the deepest part of the sea, the thing that immediately came to mind was, and this is a little dark, but Osama bin Laden's body. that
Mm.
after the successful raid, it was like, well, wherever we leave this body, like
Yeah.
didn't want to obviously bring it back to America and make it a trophy type appearance, and didn't want to put it somewhere where it could be buried to create a shrine to a awful man. So they just, as far as they've told us, took it out to sea and just dropped it in the ocean.
I just like to point out that I'm about to reference one of your favorite film series, which feels wrong. This felt very much like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Just go put it somewhere where no one's going to find it, kind of thing, right? I don't think they have a big warehouse full of boxes, so the bottom of the ocean is as close as it gets.
Yeah, or let the Holy Grail roll into a bottomless crevasse, and we won't worry about it ever again.
Yeah,
Nor will the people who drank from it be immortal, but that's okay too.
yes, I remember all of these details from all of those movies that I've definitely seen since I was like 12. Uh, I really liked
Movie
these
festival.
chapters.
You all heard it. You all heard it. He just committed to watch Indiana Jones with me. He says right after the weekend we were away together and could have watched all five Indiana Jones movies.
I am very glad we did not. I really had a good time with these chapters, right? They move things along. They are just good fun. Sometimes good fun is such good fun that I don't have anything to say about it. This is a short episode, but good. We've got 2 weeks left. Go read some fun stuff. Any last thoughts before we let people go enjoy themselves and read chapter 56, Golden Eyes?
Whether it's my own misogyny or not, I will just say that again, this was my least favorite of the plots, but I will say it was a satisfying wrap up, and so I look forward to that. Your opening question also was a reminder that all the books so far, everybody has come back together, and at times, kind of
Yeah.
in via means that stretched credulity. And so to see, as far as we can tell, that not everybody's coming together is a change worth noting. We'll see if the other two plots remain separate, but they are in very different parts of this continent. So I
Yeah.
would assume they are. And maybe that is something to note as we shift out of what would have been the original trilogy of these books that is now, I assume he and the publishers were fully committed by book 4. Like, this is going to be as long as you want it to be.
Yeah.
So I think we'll see some of those changes. So next week, just a single chapter, friends. It's chapter 56, Golden Eyes. And then, as Tyler alluded to, the week after that, we will lump together the final two chapters. And then, most likely, the week after that, we'll do one quick wrap up. So, this
Yeah.
is your kind of 1 month warning that you need the next book,
The
The
Fires of
Fires
Heaven.
of Heaven. As soon as 1 month from now. So if you were doing the casual wait to find it at a bookstore, maybe now's the time to hit up bookshop.org or another independent bookstore website. We don't need any more money to Bezos. And prepare yourselves because we're going to get there eventually through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.